welcome. My name's Donald Godfrey, and I'm welcoming everybody to our very first virtual University Ministry faculty lecture. Usually this event is like over a luncheon and quite casual. So I know that our speaker today wants to keep that casual feel to it. So certainly as a Jesuit university, our commitment to racial and social justice is an essential dimension, of course, of who we are. And I was just reading the scripture for the Catholic liturgy this morning is from Isaiah. And Isaiah says, God shall judge the poor with justice and decide aright for the land's afflicted. Then the wolf shall be a guest of the lamb, and the leopard lie down with the kid. There shall be no harm or ruin on all my holy mountain. It seemed an appropriate reading for today's topic. So it gives me a particular pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Professor Lara Bazelon is professor at our University of San Francisco School of Law, where she also holds the Philip and Muriel C. Barnett Chair in Trial Advocacy and directs our criminal and juvenile justice and racial justice clinics. Previously, Lara was visiting associate professor at another Jesuit institution, Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, where she directed the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent. Lara is widely published, as we just heard. Julie say she enjoys reading her in the New York Times and everywhere else. Her first book is Rectify, the Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction. Lara was a trial lawyer in Los Angeles for 7 years, and I'm personally fascinated by the title you've chosen for today's talk, Lara, possibly because as I just told you, in a different life, I might have become a trial lawyer myself. And that's because many years ago, I did don a wig, needed even then, and was called to the Irish bar. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Professor Lara Bazelon, whose title is Embracing Restorative Justice, a Trial Lawyer's Non-Linear Journey. Lara, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be with all of you today. I'm sorry that we're not in person and having a delicious lunch, so I hope everyone's having a delicious lunch in their respective places. And I just want to welcome all of you and thank you again for coming, and also say at the outset to please, if you feel moved to do so, drop any questions that you have into the chat as I'm talking, because I really was hoping for this to be conversational, and I realized that that's easier said than done on Zoom, but I would love to engage with all of you as I'm talking and get your thoughts and reactions. And of course, obviously at the end of this, I'll be taking some questions. It's not a super long PowerPoint, it's very visual. And so I think without further ado, I'm going to get started. So Ali, if you don't mind moving to the next slide. So the way that I was raised, and I mean that sort of in my home, but I also mean that in the legal profession, was to see the world as a kind of Manichaean universe. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with this concept of Manichaeism, basically it posits that there's good and there's evil, and there's not a whole lot in between. And that really, to some degree, is the sum total of a trial lawyer's vision in trial of the world, which is that it boils down to your side versus the other side. It's very binary. And so what you have on one side is good, you have evil, you have right and wrong, light and darkness. And of course, at the end of the trial, you have a victor and then you have the vanquished. And that was very much the way I was trained. And it was also, I think, fundamental to succeeding in an adversarial system. So when I joined the Federal Public Defender's Office in 2001, I was 27, and then I spent the next 7 years, I tried, I think, maybe a dozen cases, and my mindset in all of the cases was basically the mindset that I just described to you right now, and that seemed to me to be the way to be a lawyer. That's how I fundamentally understood my role as a trial lawyer, which was that it was my client and me up against the power of the state. And my clients, because I was a public defender, didn't have any money. And often they were just very marginalized. They grew up in poverty. They were often people of color. They were people who got on the wrong side of the facts and the law when maybe other people who were more fortunate managed to escape those kinds of consequences. And once they got on the wrong side, it was the federal government that was marshaling its resources, often to try to incarcerate them for really long periods of time. And basically, what they had was a representative, me, and that person was standing between them and the state. And I have a feeling, although I have not asked, that the federal prosecutors that I was up against probably had a pretty similar view where they thought that they were on the side of the good and the righteous, and they were trying to put someone away who they considered to have done something wrong, who they considered to be dangerous, what have you. And so that was really the state of affairs for me for about for a long time, for over a decade. And then I kind of had a transformational moment, and I can talk about that in the next slide. Thank you, Ali. In 2013, I had a case that really transformed my life. At that point, I was um, as Father Godfrey said, I was at Loyola Law School, and I was directing a very small innocence project there. And in 2012, we got a case involving a man whose name is Cash Register. That's his actual name. And he had been convicted in 1979 of the murder of an elderly white man. Cash is African American. He was 18 at the time. He didn't really have a criminal record. He had an alibi, and there was no forensic evidence against him. It was just these two pretty compromised eyewitnesses, but it was an all-white jury, and that was enough for them, and they convicted him. And he got life without the possibility of parole. That was later changed to life with parole. And Cash had always insisted that he was innocent, and he had 11 different parole hearings over the course of the next 34 years. And at every single parole hearing, he was essentially told that if he just admitted it, he would be let out. And at every parole hearing, he refused to admit to what he didn't do. At one point, he said, "A mistake has been made here, and no one wants to correct it." And when we further investigated this case, and it took a long time to really dig into it because it had happened so long ago, we realized that not only had the police hidden evidence that pretty conclusively showed that there were other witnesses who knew him and said that it was not him, and that the witnesses who the state had put up were very incentivized to lie because they were getting these deals that were not disclosed, but also that there was just huge levels of just misconduct and terrible lawyering. And it was just a case that was kind of rotten from the bottom to the top. And when we brought that case to the LA District Attorney's Office, we put all of our cards on the table, and we explained everything that we had found out. And we said, we want you to just do the right thing and go into court and overturn this conviction. We can just agree to do that. They did not want to agree to do that. And so what happened next was that essentially we had what was basically a retrial. And the day of the verdict, it made the front page of the LA Times because he was the longest serving exoneree in history at that point. And that's a picture of us right after the verdict. And you might think that this is a strange transformational moment because, of course, what I've described to you is extremely adversarial. And it was very, very adversarial. And I was extremely angry. And I was angry because I thought that what the DA was doing was not just legally baseless, but also cruel. I was angry because the litigation of this case was so consuming that it took me away from my family for long periods of time. I was angry that his mother, who was in her late 70s, was going to have to wait months and months and months longer for him to be released. And I was angry because all of those decades of his life had been stolen. And I thought, sort of at the end of the case, that as the attorney, I would kind of experience a level of catharsis with his exoneration. And instead, what I experienced was this sense that his life was going to have to go on, and it was going to require some degree of reconciliation. And so I watched that process happen. And part of that was really thinking about not just my client and his mom, but the people on the other side of this case, the victim's family, who had come to the retrial believing, because the state had told them, that this was a guilty person. And it was just a question of him getting reconvicted all over again after they tidied up these technicalities that we had raised. And of course, the family sitting there week after week watched the state's case fall apart and watched the witnesses, including the police, be exposed as liars. And it really made me think for the first time about all of the different harms that the system visits upon people and how the system isn't really designed to address those harms, not in the traditional sense. And so I started thinking about other ways of moving toward justice for somebody like my client, for so many other people like my client, and for people who are so-called rightfully convicted. And in that process, I started thinking about trying to see the world in a less binary way. Next slide, please. So what this case taught me, and really what I've learned over and over again in what's now almost 20 years of representing people, is that while the Supreme Court promises us all equal justice under law, and that's a picture of the Supreme Court, and those words are engraved right under that cornice, it is a false promise. Our system is really premised on this Manichaean model, and it tells us the law will be applied equally. It tells us that everybody will receive the same justice. And it tells us that in the end, right will prevail over wrong. And of course, Cash's case, more than any other case in my life, made it clear what a false promise that is and how unequally applied it is. And I believe to this day that if he had been Caucasian, he never would have been convicted. And I believe to this day that part of why the jury convicted him was because they did not value his life in the same way. And I believe to this day that had he been able to get representation that was competent, he would not have been convicted. And I believe to this day that the police treat communities of color differently and worse than they treat white communities, all of which is to say that this promise is not a promise that we live up to. But I also think that's true for all of my other clients, in that, guilty or not guilty, our system makes this promise to all of us, and in particular to victims, that the carceral solution is the right solution, that the most severe punishment, that a conviction and prison is the answer to pretty much any kind of a criminal harm. And that in the end, that is what is going to provide closure and finality and healing. And to me, that is another false promise. Next slide, please. So the way that I've started to think about this Manichaean idea, is that it's very reductionist. So at the end of the day, what we say about people who commit harms is that they are what they did, and they have no other identity, which is why we call people felons, robbers, murderers, inmates. They don't have names. Once they go to prison, they have numbers. There's no sense that there's a human being behind the deed. It's just the thing they did. We also, in this Manichaean way, refuse to see that so often people who are caught up in the criminal justice system were victims themselves. And rather than understand that there's a Venn diagram with an enormous amount of overlap between victims and offenders, we separate them out and we say that one is in the light, which is the victim, and one is in the darkness, which is the person who caused the harm. And that too is a fundamental misunderstanding of the way harms are caused and experienced and who we are as human beings. And the final way that we reduce them, which is what I was saying a bit earlier, is we have this sense that they're deserving of these terrible, extreme, even everlasting punishments. And again, it goes back to the idea that they are the worst thing that they ever did. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense, alone among industrialized countries, the United States embraces the death penalty. We embrace life without the possibility of parole sentences. We embrace, in 46 states and the District of Columbia, the felony murder rule, which allows jurors to jump over the question of intent and just say, if this person intended to commit the lower level felony, say a burglary that went wrong, but someone died as a result, they can be convicted of the murder. And until the Supreme Court outlawed it in 2005, we permitted the execution of children who were as young as 16. And to this day, we have over 2,000 of those children who are locked up for life. And in fact, my racial justice clinic is representing someone who was convicted as a teenager with a not very serious prior record, who is serving 65 years without the possibility of parole unless we can get him out. And not only was he completely undeserving of that sentence, he's also innocent. And so we have this idea that this kind of a consequence, this kind of a tremendous steep price, whether you did it or not, is somehow appropriate, and that the state regularly taking people's lives. And in the past month, we've seen this current presidential administration execute one federal prisoner after another, that is acceptable, again, because I think we are really addicted to this idea that there's black and white and right and wrong and no in-betweens. Next slide, please. So the criminal justice system, in the same way that it reduces offenders, also reduces victims. We reduce them because we assume that they have nothing in common with the people who harmed them. That is rarely the case. Stranger on stranger crimes are the exception, not the rule. Most harms that happen are intra-community harms. Most people know each other and are connected to each other. We presume that all victims want and need the same thing, and that is, we tell them the meting out of the harshest possible punishment. And we also tell victims what I think is another falsehood, which is that the carceral solution, putting away the person who harmed them for a very long period of time, is going to be the thing that is going to make them whole, is going to heal their harm, because the darkness will be replaced by the light. And that's what they're told. That's what we tell victims. So we reduce them in the same way that we reduce offenders. Next slide, please. We do some pretty terrible things to victims. And it wasn't really until the aftermath of Cash's case that I spent a lot of time talking to victims. And I did that in part because for research for the book that I wrote about restorative justice. And that was really the sort of the motivating reason. But the time that I spent with the victims ended up really changing the way that I practiced law. And which is to say that when I was a federal public defender, I really tried not to think about victims at all. I thought of them, when I thought about them, as people that I had to cross-examine, undermine, and discredit. I knew that they had the right to speak at sentencing. It was often difficult to listen, and I just tried not to be affected by it because I had a job to do if my client was convicted, which is try to mitigate the sentence. And I always told my clients, look down at the ground, because no matter what they did when they looked at the victim, it was likely to be misinterpreted. And that's advice coming from the lawyer. So think about what the victims are experiencing when they're in the courtroom with the person who harmed them. First of all, their harms are not at the center of the case. What happened to them is taken over by the state. It's not even their name on the case. It's people versus the offender. Their name is removed. Their body becomes evidence. Their story is carved up and told by the prosecution. It's not really their story anymore. And these are in the rare cases that actually go to trial. Of course, more than 90% of cases are either dismissed, in which case no one hears their story, or they result in a guilty plea, in which case oftentimes there's just very little said about what happened in the courtroom, and they're not really included in that bargaining process. Also, the people who harmed them are incentivized to deny it. They're incentivized to deny it if they go to trial. They're incentivized to minimize it if they plead guilty. And at sentencing, they're also incentivized to take the minimum amount of responsibility, particularly if it's going to complicate an issue that they have on appeal, or of course, if they didn't actually do it or didn't do the exact thing that they were being accused of doing. In trials, our Constitution requires that the person who harmed them be presumed innocent. And what that actually means is juries are constitutionally obligated to view what victims say with skepticism. That's their constitutional job. So when you put all of that together, And then you add on top of that cross-examination. What most victims will tell you is that going through the criminal justice system is profoundly re-traumatizing, either because they feel ignored or sidelined, or because in the moment when the light is shining on them, they're incredibly disempowered and even being actively harmed. Next slide. So I started learning about restorative justice after Cash's exoneration. And restorative justice is this centuries old practice. It was practiced by Native people to this country. It was practiced by indigenous tribes in different countries all over the world. And it's a really different way of thinking about harm and thinking about victims. So, in the traditional criminal justice system, we ask these three basic questions. We want to know what crime was committed, who committed it, and what kind of a punishment we should mete out to the person who committed the crime. Restorative justice is really trying to reframe the whole situation and center on the person who was victimized. And it asks who was harmed, what are that person's needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So then how does that play out in practice? Next slide. What it does is it brings together people who have been harmed and the people who have harmed them. And oftentimes it brings together their families too, and the people who support them in their life. And the focus is on healing and it's on redemption. And there are different ways to do restorative justice. There can be what are called victim offender dialogues, which are direct conversations between the two parties, mediated by a very well-trained facilitator. And there are also healing circles involving all of these different people who have a role to play as a support person or maybe a community person who was also indirectly harmed, who are coming together. Restorative justice, unlike the criminal justice system, which is really offender-centered, is victim-centered. And what happens in restorative justice is that the victims are empowered to tell their stories and they can tell them on their own terms, in their own way. And the person who caused the harm has to listen to that story, hear it, really take it in, has to acknowledge the harm that was caused and look deep within themselves to the root causes of what led to the harm and really reckon with it. And some people say, this really sounds like an easy way out to me. I mean, it would just be so much worse to have to go to prison. And all you have to do maybe is like sit in a circle and hold hands, and then you can just get up. And what anybody who has been through a restorative process will tell you is that it's harder than prison, because in jail and prison, all you have to do is sit there and do time. You don't have to account for yourself. You don't have to struggle with your internal demons. You don't have to talk about the trauma in your own life that led you to that point. And you don't actually have to hear with an open mind and an open heart the harm that you have caused somebody else. And you don't have to move forward with that person. And restorative justice requires that. It requires a joint plan to repair the harm, whatever the parties think of it as. So there's a real creative aspect to this. And the point of that really is to assuage concerns that victims have of this ever happening to somebody else. Because what victims want not only is to have their own harm acknowledged, and the criminal justice system is not very good at doing that, they also want the person held accountable. And the only way the criminal justice system is really able to hold people accountable is by putting them away. Victims don't necessarily think about that as accountability. They want to see transformation and change. They want to see reckoning. And that's what restorative justice can offer. Next slide. So I've been thinking more since I got to USF, and I have the honor of running these two clinics, about the role of restorative justice as a path to racial and gender justice for victims and for offenders. My students and I represent people who are overwhelmingly people of color. We tend to represent people who are in abusive relationships or have been abused in the past or caught up in situations that really involve tremendously broken relationships, family, romantic, and otherwise. And what is clear through the time that we've all spent together at this law school working on these cases is that overwhelmingly they occur within communities and even within families. And that these communities are decimated and they've been torn apart by mass incarceration. That there's no evidence really that prison rehabilitates, often because it doesn't offer those inside anything. And to just give you an example, my innocent client in Louisiana is in a prison called Dixon Correctional Institution. He's been there since he was 19. He's really smart. He was in the gifted and talented program in middle school and high school, and there are no opportunities for him whatsoever. And the reasoning is because he's going to die in there. So what's the point of offering him any programming at all? And so the only way that he can get an education is by people on the outside sending him books and other ways to sort of do it on his own, but there's nothing inside for him. And that's a pretty typical story in a lot of facilities. But the other thing that we really know is that the people who are supposed to be healed by having somebody locked up for that amount of time often do not feel healed, do not feel better, and they are asking for, they want something different. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about an example because I like concrete examples. I know these are theories and you might wonder, well, how does this actually work? There is an organization in New York, in Brooklyn, called Common Justice, and it's run by an amazing woman named Danielle Sered, who wrote a great book called Until We Reckon, which I highly recommend. And it's a unique program. She partners with the King County District Attorney in Brooklyn, a guy named Eric Gonzalez. And this program's been up and running for over a decade. What they do is that they funnel people through who are between the ages of 18 to 26. They're overwhelmingly Black and brown men, and they've been charged with extremely serious crimes, usually shootings, stabbings, and even maiming people. And oftentimes the people that they've harmed are people in their own communities. Basically what the DA says to them is, do you want the traditional process? Do you want a guilty plea or a trial, or do you want this alternative? And 90% of the people who have been victimized choose restorative justice. They would prefer that as an alternative. It's a very well-run, very exceptional program, and I hope that it's replicated. And one of the reasons why we know it's remarkable is because the recidivism rate is only 6%, and that's 1/6 of the recidivism rate for those who go through the traditional adjudicatory process. So that's just one example of how restorative justice can work. People often think, oh, well, it might be fine for kids, like kids can change, but maybe for shoplifting or something like that. But if you shoot somebody, you need to go to prison. And this program takes that belief and really challenges it at its core and says, we need to think about restorative justice, not just for low-level crimes and not just for children, although of course, I truly believe it's very, very well suited to many of those cases. But we can also think about it for violent crimes. We can also think about it for people who we consider to be dangerous. And we can think about it that way because we know that our traditional system has not only a high recidivism rate, but a very low victim satisfaction rate. Next slide, please. So I wanted just to pause here and talk about the growth of restorative justice. So it went from being really an outlier idea that most people were not familiar with to a plank in the platform of many of the people who started running and winning races for DA, including our own DA, Chesa Boudin. And that is because we started realizing that mass incarceration was not only not a solution, but it was fundamentally racist and fundamentally harmful. So it was sort of the anti-solution. And people started to think about, okay, well, what are some alternatives to prison? And not only that, the kinds of people who are running to be the top prosecutor in their cities and counties looked quite different than the way that we're normally used to thinking about prosecutors. So perhaps many of you are familiar with Sam Waterston from Law and Order, but generally it's an older white guy. And in fact, statistically, that's true. Until 2015, 95% of prosecutors were white men, usually older white men. Less than 1% were women of color. And we've really seen a sea change since that time. And I've just put up a couple of pictures of some of the progressive prosecutors who have run and won, all including restorative justice as at least part of their platform. And they really range, as you can see, Kim Fox, who is the state's attorney for Cook County, which encompasses Chicago, Larry Krasner, who's the DA in Philadelphia, Rachel Rollins, who is the district attorney in Suffolk County, which encompasses Boston, Kim Fox, who's the Circuit County attorney in St. Louis, Wesley Bell, who is the state's attorney in, it's in Missouri, but I can't remember which city. anyway, it's close to Kim Gardner. And then of course, Chesa Boudin, who ran and won on a reform platform in San Francisco and took office in 2019. And they all have these really diverse backgrounds. They're diverse people, but they also have diverse backgrounds. And in particular, a couple of these folks actually never prosecuted anybody before they ran for office, including our current DA, whose parents were incarcerated for murder when he was 18 months old. In fact, his dad is still in prison. And unless he gets clemency, will probably die in prison. So he grew up without his biological parents. And he talked during the campaign a lot about the role that restorative justice had played in his life, and how, of course, he had been a collateral victim of the consequences of the decision that his parents had made when he was just a baby. And I was really lucky to be part of his policy team. And part of the policy that he adopted was that he was going to offer restorative justice to any victim who wanted it, which is not to say only restorative justice or restorative justice instead of anything else, but that he was really going to expand the existing RJ alternatives in the San Francisco DA's office so that more victims could have access to that kind of a solution. And we're seeing this take place. I mean, all of these folks have jurisdiction over very populous counties. And then George Gascon, who just won in LA, also a very populous county. So while they're the minority in terms of the number of prosecutors nationwide, they exercise jurisdiction over millions and millions of people. And so I think as they go forward, and Kim Gardner and Kim Foxx just won re-election, we're going to see restorative justice take hold, hopefully in a new way and in a broader way than it has in the past. Next slide, please. And then I also wanted to talk just briefly about restorative justice and sexual violence, and in particular, restorative justice in Title IX. And I want to talk about that because we do Title IX work in the Racial Justice Clinic. And again, I think that people think of restorative justice as maybe an extremely poor fit for this particular kind of crime. But in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that not in all cases, but in some cases, victims in sexual assault cases may actually prefer a restorative alternative. And that's for a number of reasons, many of which I've gone over, including just how incredibly re-traumatizing the traditional adjudicatory process is, but also because despite the fact that we've made a lot of reforms, it's extremely hard to get a conviction in a sexual assault case. And so most victims never see the inside of a courtroom, never mind a conviction. And so this is an alternative. And I wanted to just talk briefly about a different program. It was called the PRISM Project. It was federally funded, and then unfortunately the funding dried up. It was run by a visionary woman, a psychologist named Dr. Mary Koss at Arizona State University. And she partnered with the Pima County District Attorney's Office, and they would funnel sexual assault cases into this program with the consent of the victims. And they really ranged, they were all different kinds of sexual assault cases. And what she did a regression analysis after collecting about 3 years of data, and 90% of the people who participated felt that justice had been done. In the people who had been victimized, their level of PTSD dropped off significantly from 82 to 66%. And we know from other countries that use restorative justice more widely that this can be an alternative. So for example, in Australia, where RJ is used in juvenile sexual offense cases, they studied 232 cases and found the offenders were 40% less likely to reoffend than juvenile offenders who were sent through the traditional adjudicatory process. All of this to say, it's not a substitute, but I do think that victims deserve alternatives. And so where this has kind of been an interesting evolution has been in the Racial Justice Clinic itself, where my students and I represent people, mostly young men of color, I think entirely, who have been accused of some kind of a Title IX offense on a college or a university campus. And what I've learned from doing these cases, well, I've learned a couple of things. One thing I've learned is that having the support of students and having legal advice and representation is the difference between saving somebody's education and having that person be expelled and labeled a Title IX sex offender and essentially having their education end abruptly. But I've also learned that when the campuses attempt to adopt these adjudicatory processes from the criminal justice system, and they tend to kind of import the Manichaean universe, in my experience litigating these cases, it goes badly for everyone. And I have never seen a Title IX case, no matter what the outcome, in which both parties didn't emerge profoundly harmed. And what's been interesting for the students and me is to know now that restorative justice is on the table in some schools. And we've been lucky enough to be able to begin to engage with it. And that has been a very exciting development, in part because it really feels like, in some cases, not all, but in some, an important alternative. Because again, in these cases, which can be murky and can be really complicated, there is an incentive to deny on the one side and demand an accounting on the other side. And of course, the adjudicatory process that the schools have in place is not designed to facilitate that. And what restorative justice does is it requires discussion and listening and reckoning, which is often what I think is so badly desired and needed. And I want to be clear, not in all cases, but certainly in some, and it's been exciting to see that happen. Next slide, please. So I did a little bit of, not a little, I did a lot of research into this because I was curious, again, to think about it from the victim's perspective. And as I said, in the RJC, we represent the people who have been accused. It's really important for me to understand both sides. And this sort of goes to my point about like moving away from my ideas of right and wrong, good and bad, and there's one person telling the truth and one person not. To really understand sexual assault and Title IX and restorative justice, I thought it was very, very important to engage with people who had themselves been victimized. And there are real leaders in a line of thought from people who've been directly harmed in this particular kind of way, that for some of them, what they would prefer is a restorative alternative. And so I have some of their pictures up here. Sujatha Baliga was given the MacArthur Genius Award in 2019 for her pioneering work with restorative justice. She works in Oakland at a place called Impact Justice, and she does a lot of the restorative justice programming with local DAs. And she's been on the forefront of arguing that we should apply restorative justice in cases of sexual assault where that's something that the victim wants. She herself was victimized by her own father in a pretty terrible way, and she talks really meaningfully about why the criminal system was not going to be something that was going to be helpful for her and her family because of the dire consequences that they would have faced. Her father being removed from the home, the family being deprived of a breadwinner, their already marginalized status as one of the few non-white people in their community. And so she talks about how she would have vastly preferred that a different alternative had been on the table. Stephanie Harrelson is someone who was sexually assaulted while she was in college. She reported it, and she was very badly treated by the Title IX office. She was not believed by the administrators. Her case was not brought forward, and I think she left school feeling doubly harmed by her experience in that system. And she too has written really powerfully about restorative justice. Tarana Burke, who of course is the founder of Me Too, has talked about restorative justice and transformational justice. Heather Marlowe, who was assaulted in San Francisco and whose rape kit went untested for years and years, has written a one-woman play about her experience. These are all very different women with very different lived experiences, but I think what they would agree on is that this traditional adjudicatory system was either not an option for them or failed them. And they've all written and thought and advocated quite movingly in some instances for the use of alternatives. Next slide, please. So people sometimes ask me if the criminal justice system can be replaced by restorative justice. And that's especially, I think, a popular question with people who really believe in prison abolition. And this idea that maybe we can replace our existing system because we know it's so flawed with something better. And I tend to fall on the side of realism. I don't think that restorative justice can replace our system, in part because it's central to this very uniquely American concept of justice. It's embedded in our Constitution, in many of our amendments, including the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. Restorative justice is making inroads for all the reasons that I said, but it's slow, and many people are loath to accept that it could be broadly used, for example, in the ways that it's being used in Brooklyn. And I think it's also important to point out that not all victims want restorative justice. In thinking about victims and talking with victims, one thing that I've realized is just how incredibly disempowering it is, not just to have been victimized in the moment, but then to have to move forward and live with it and have all of your choices taken away. Right now, what we say to victims is we can offer you the carceral solution or we can offer you nothing. I tend to think we should offer victims as many options as there are possible to place on the table, because I think it's more empowering to have options and be able to decide rather than being told. So I don't think that we should take something away from victims who want an adjudicatory process. And I feel pretty strongly about that. And I also think that restorative justice is just not a fit for every case. Not all victims are interested in it, and not all people who cause harm are in a place in their life where they're really able to do that work. And so I realize that that's a somewhat controversial thing for me to say, because what I really want to say is, of course, we can replace our system. It's so broken, but I don't think that restorative justice can replace criminal justice. I think in some cases it can. I think in some cases it can work as an adjunct to the system, maybe post plea or when someone's incarcerated as a way of programming and hoping to get parole. That happens a lot. And I do think, of course, it can be used in lieu of being charged in the ways that I've described, but I don't think it can 100% replace the system that we have. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk about now is the need, I think, for righteous anger and advocacy, because, and maybe this is selfish and I'm just speaking to my own personality traits and trying to justify them, but I do think that we still need those things. And so when I think about how angry I was in Cash's case, I think about that as an important kind of righteous anger that you need. It's a fuel that you need to be able to advocate fiercely against some pretty implacable forces and against a lot of inertia. And oftentimes that's what we're left with. You know, there is one alternative most places, and that alternative is what we have in our Constitution. It's the criminal justice system. And to function in that system, especially when you're standing up for people who have been marginalized and people who have the odds stacked against them, you need to be able to marshal, I think, righteous anger, and you do need to be able to advocate in a somewhat binary way. And so again, perhaps this is a controversial thing to say, but I really believe there's a place for that kind of advocacy, and that most cases that we have in our clinic, for example, require that kind of advocacy. And so, for example, many of the classes in the syllabus teach the students how to make an opening statement and give a closing argument and pick a jury and conduct a cross-examination, because they're going to need those skills to go into court and fight the battles that need to be fought, because that's the bigger war on in most courtrooms across the United States. Across the United States, the criminal justice system is the default, and it requires being able to have those particular tools. And I personally don't believe it's possible to function effectively within the system that we have without being able to master adversarial tactics. And I think while there are plenty of people who are less angry and calmer than I am, I do think that being indignant about injustice and being able to stand up for somebody sometimes does require being angry, and sometimes requires being able to fight back. And so that is a big part of what I teach my students to do, even though I also teach them about restorative justice. I don't replace one with the other. Next slide, please. And then I think about this a lot, which is the application of restorative justice in your own life. And I thought about this a lot during the process of researching and writing my book, because I think the other problem with trial lawyering adversarial thinking as a life philosophy is that it can make you very rigid and self-righteous and unforgiving. And so what I started to think about with restorative justice was that not only was it a legal philosophy, but that it could also be a deeply personal philosophy. And that when I started to think about it, I started to look at the broken relationships in my own life and the stories that I told myself about how those relationships came to be broken. And quite often I told myself Manichaean stories where in my story, all the facts were on my side. It was like I was giving a closing argument and just hammering away at this other person who I felt quite self-righteously had done all of these terrible things. And what restorative justice really made me start to do, and when I started to think about both sides, I started to think about people who were harmed and people who had done the harm, is that in so many relationships, both things are happening at the same time, which is to say, you're being harmed and you're harming the other person too. And that most stories are not the Manichaean universe type of stories, even though, at least speaking for myself, those tended to be the kind of stories I would tell myself when important relationships in my own life would fall apart. And so I think what's been helpful for me in using restorative justice, not only as a lawyer, but as a human being, is asking myself if there's a different story. And that in that different story, is there a place where I am accountable to? And almost always the answer to that question is yes. And then I ask myself another question, which is, would my life be better? Would I be less angry or bitter or sad if I could repair the relationship, if it was reparable? And the answer is often yes. Not always, not all relationships are reparable, but most are, with enough extending oneself and enough humility. And so for me, the answer is often yes, even if that means I have to go more than 50% of the way. I have to go 60 or 75 or 80 or even 90% of the way. Oftentimes, it's still worth it. And when I say that in sort of percentages, I mean from my own perspective, but of course, from the other person's perspective, they may feel the opposite. And I think that's kind of the point. And then I think the bigger point, and this is the question that I've been asking myself really in the last, well, I guess since Cash's case is it at least worth asking these questions? Is it at least worth considering a universe that is all of these muted gray colors rather than this black and white world, which is in fact a very rigid, unforgiving, kind of a cold place to live in. And so my answer to those questions is yes. And for me personally, and as a lawyer, embracing a different philosophy, thinking about restorative justice, thinking about multiple sides of a story, thinking about radical empathy and reckoning and accountability has been transformative. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it and why I said it was non-linear, because it's not as if any one person gets to the other side. It's not an A to B, and it's not a replacement. It's not one thing over another, but it's a more layered and nuanced, and I think thoughtful way of living one's life. And that is the end of my talk. And I just welcome any questions or comments that anybody has.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lara. I know that this morning, not only did you have an early TV interview, but you moved house and then you got a phone call from your editor unexpectedly. So thank you for an amazing lecture at the end of a very busy morning. But I do have one question in the chat room, which and then I'll let you take the questions from people as they want, either in chat room, I think, or you can also people can just put their hand up, right, and ask a question in person. This is, if the roots of restorative justice are in collective societies with folks who ostensibly claim one another or recall we belong to each other, can you speak to the challenges, promise for restorative justice practice in today's urban settings? I think you maybe answered that partly. And this was asked halfway through the lecture, but maybe you have something.
Like, are you saying, is a question like sort of if the person's not in your immediate community, but you're more just sort of dispersed? Or
Yes, yeah,
okay.
no, if they in a more urban setting where people don't know each other ostensibly, there's less sense of connection and community, I suppose. Yeah.
I
Is it
think
harder? Yeah.
it is, yes. I mean, the honest answer is that it is harder to do that, because I think in urban centers we tend to kind of stick to our set routines, and maybe we know our neighbors a little bit, but not really. And it isn't the same thing as living in a small town or a native community centuries ago, where really, I think part of restorative justice was about holding on to your community, because the only other punishment was really leaving the person behind to sort of die in a wilderness. So I do think it's more of a challenge. but I also think it's worth engaging. And I say that because it seems to me that if we just extend ourselves a little bit, we can forge bonds that are maybe tenuous and obviously not the same kind of intimate bonds that we have with close friends and family, but that can make us feel more connected to our community. And it has been really interesting to see some folks in San Francisco engaged with restorative justice with the San Francisco DA. And of course, we live in a urban center, and they could have chosen this other path, but they do want that sense of like connecting and feeling like they know what happens on the other side of their case. And so I do think it is doable, but I also concede that it's much harder when we're so dispersed and separated from each other.
Thank you, Lara. I'm sure there's other people with questions or comments.
So this question is, where do I find reason to hope for the possibility of restorative justice? I, I find reason to hope in so many ways. I find reason to hope because I've seen it happen. I've been lucky enough to participate in circles where I've seen people on both sides of a harm connect over it and move forward with their lives in a really positive way. I feel hopeful because I've talked to people who have participated in it. I wasn't there, but they've talked to me about um, the transformative impact that it has on their lives. I have reason to hope because I see it starting to spring up at least a little bit in the racial justice clinic. And so that makes me hopeful because I'm seeing it happen for our clients. And so it's not that I'm hopeful because, oh, it's happening on this macro level that millions and millions of people are receiving it and benefiting from it. I'm hopeful because on a very anecdotal level in my own life and in my own legal practice, and then maybe more broadly in the kind of national research I've done with these DA offices, I've seen it in action and I've seen it be very effective. And I feel like that kind of success will then lead to more success because more people will want to try something that is an alternative to something that they know doesn't work or doesn't work for them. This question is from Julie. It's, how do you decide to do this work? When did you discover you wanted to work with the prison community? And what is arguably the most intense part of the criminal justice system? So yeah, I think, so I guess the sort of the, the way back answer is that I always wanted to defend people who had been accused because I felt like they were treated unfairly. I'm not exactly sure where that came from, probably because I'm sure as a kid I felt wrongly accused myself, and perhaps without the advocacy to fight back against my parents or whoever was accusing me of stuff. But in any event, I've always wanted to do that and felt really strongly that the system was unfair. And I think wanting to work within the prison community, that was more thinking through, I think that more grew out of like the legal research and the legal writing that I did. And also, also it grew out of the fact that in the criminal and juvenile justice clinic, we represent people in San Quentin who are seeking release under a youthful offender parole statute. And what that means is that if they were convicted of a very serious crime when they were a teenager, actually all the way up until the age of 26, they have a chance to get out much, much earlier. So these are people who did very serious things, were convicted and got extremely long sentences. And the students and I and Professor O'Donnell, we work very closely with these clients, and then we represent them at their parole hearings. And many, many of them have done restorative justice inside of San Quentin, because San Quentin is actually one of the rare prisons that offers some pretty rich programming. And so when they present their case and they talk about themselves to the board, we're there for it. And we listen to them talk about what they experienced in terms of participating in restorative justice while they were incarcerated. And it's pretty moving. I think these hearings are really almost like an MRI of the soul. They can be 6 or 7 hours long, and you're listening to almost every detail of this person's life. And so often these people who committed these crimes when they were young just have terrible stories of trauma and abuse. And to see them many years later talk about how they've come to understand sort of the root causes of what caused them to do what they did and what they've learned, and even the ones who've been allowed to reconnect with the people that they've harmed, has been tremendously moving. And then the last part, what's arguably the most intense part of the criminal justice system. That is a hard question to answer because it's all incredibly intense. It's so intense. I think the most intense part of the criminal justice system is being in trial. There is really no more intense experience than representing somebody in a trial. And it's very hard to describe what that's like, other than to say it's almost like an out of body experience. I don't think there's anything you can ever do in your life that's like that. This is from Eugene. He asked, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just before you go to Eugene's question, people should feel free to put on their cameras if they want. So we
Oh,
can,
absolutely.
so please don't feel you have to keep your camera off. This will be available later, so that if you miss some of it, it'll be around. So thank you. Sorry, you can go to Eugene's question.
Oh, sure. So Eugene asked, can you talk a little bit more about how or why people who practice some of the principles that you described on your last slide, asking whether reconciliation would make me less bitter, recognizing that both sides have contributed to the broken relationship, willing to do more than 50% of the work to repair the relationship in their personal lives, are so opposed to applying those same principles at a societal level? That is a really great question. And I think it's about othering. I think the answer is that when we look at people in the larger society who've been accused or charged or convicted of crimes, we see them as the other. And I think when we think about, perhaps, at least when I say we, I guess I'm really, really generalizing, and I'm saying middle-class people who are fairly contact free of the criminal justice system. For those of us who fall into that group, we see our own broken relationships as on a completely different level, and we don't analogize in any way the issues that we have with the various people who are important to us in our lives with the kinds of relationships that folks have who are caught up in the system, which is of course so profoundly wrong, because there's enormous levels of similarity. But I think for many people, it's much more comfortable to believe that those who are tangled up in the system are really the other. And part of it is that people don't really want to engage. They don't want to look at it. They want it to be kind of like cleaned up and thrown away. And it's much easier to think about people who are accused, who are charged, who are convicted as being bad people with lives that have no relationship to our lives and who are disposable. And I think that's a big reason why, even if there are people who are very willing to sort of practice, I guess, personal restorative justice, they're not willing to extend it beyond their own universe, because they think about it as this very binary existence. And in fact, the commonalities, the extreme levels of commonality that we have with people who are caught up in the system are profound. But I don't think that is a truth that a lot of people are comfortable acknowledging.
Hi, at this point in time, can we just ask a question like that? I'm not
Of
quite
course.
raising our hands or.
Absolutely.
Anyway, this was really an amazing presentation, Lara. I love hearing your work. I'm just very moved by it. So thank you so much for sharing this.
You're so welcome.
I'm from the School of Nursing and Health Professions, and for quite a few years I have this ongoing project where I bring formerly incarcerated persons into my classroom. I've been changing up a little bit of what the topic is, but it's almost like this community-based project where they're involved in this time to with the classroom itself. And it's sort of this joint experience where they themselves get a lot out of it, just by coming to this high prestige university, and they're the guest speakers, and they're sharing their, um, expertise, and then the students, of course, get a lot out of it. So one of the, I've actually published on it, and I've interviewed them to try to, both sides, to get a little bit of their reflection on the experience. One of the quotes that was just so powerful from a student was, um, related to something that one of the formerly incarcerated persons said, and it was, I have read about, incarceration, and I've read about the social determinants of health and how that impacts your sort of life trajectory. But to um, you know, they refer to a certain person, hear that their whole life, their uncles, their family were saying, you're going to make it big, you're going to make it to San Quentin, and that's, we're going to, get you there. Like that was like their goal. And the student was saying, and in my life, my parents were like, okay, we're going to get you to Harvard, we'll get you to Yale, and it's sort of like, it was like this amazing of, really the humanness of how they ended up where they ended up. They were basically, that was their goal, that was their pruning, if you will. And so, they were left with, how do we make a dent on that? Like restorative justice, it seems like it is like secondary or tertiary prevention that we look at in the healthcare field. Like, how do we get to the primary prevention where we can break that cycle? And I kind of know the answer. I'm kind of thinking that, restorative justice will maybe help their children, you know what I mean? And maybe that's the goal, but do you make that really explicit sometimes, that it is also, part of a primary prevention?
This is a really resonant question. I mean, my reflexive response is sort of like, by the time people like me are involved, it's sort of too late, right?
Mhm.
And I guess, I'm just thinking again about my client in Louisiana. I'm going to go down there and see him next week. And I've been doing a lot of, and my students actually have been doing most of this amazing work, just talking to all of the primary people in his life and kind of reconstructing his life from birth until the present moment. And he's done a lot of it too. He's just an incredible writer, and he's written a lot about his childhood. And at so many points, I thought, oh my God, if there had just been intervention, if there had just been restorative justice at this point, and this point, at this point, because there were opportunities for things to move in a different direction. But just like the formerly incarcerated person who visited your class, I mean, it just seemed almost like he had no chance because of the circumstances that he was raised in. I mean, even the ways that his parents met, talking to his dad and hearing his dad's life story, you just could see all of these layers of generational trauma. And yet you have this person who's just a really amazing human being, and was, like I said, in the gifted and talented program, so smart, even though he had no resources. And there were just moments where, if there had been more intervention, if people in his school, or even he had gotten really sick, his doctor, if there had been like long-term sustained intervention at those more secondary education levels, I think there's a chance it would have turned out differently.
Mhm.
And I also really believe with this person, because I am determined to get him out of there, that I feel, if that's possible to do, a lot of hope that he in particular is someone who could really benefit from that. He's still quite young, and that there are people who, even if they are system involved, can come out the other side and benefit. But you're right that a lot of times these deep traumas and disadvantages are baked in. And it goes back to sort of this overlapping Venn diagram between victims and offenders, and just how these really deprived and abused children can grow up and hurt people, and and are in these devastating, intricate, dysfunctional family relationships that you feel like maybe could have been repaired along the way if someone had cared and paid enough attention.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you.
This question says, one, how many victims have chosen Boudin's restorative path, and do they fit a profile? That's a great question. I don't know. I'm going to have to ask. I know that he's put folks in charge who are really committed to reaching out very broadly, but I don't actually know the actual numbers. So I will look into that. The second part is, can you speak to the place spiritual soul hearing has and what supports are out there? I'm not sure I understand that. I'm going to go to 3. Thank you for including a personal statement of transformational experience when we walk the walk. Yes, I really don't love theoretical talks. I'm not a theoretical I'm not a particularly theoretical person, which I guess is a strange thing for an academic to say. But it's hard for me to get a hold of ideas unless I can actually like see an example of them. And it's hard for me to buy into a philosophy unless I've kind of tried it out myself. So thank you for saying that. I hope I didn't overshare it. It wasn't a case of TMI, but I do think it's really important to really engage, not just in theoretical ideas, but actually just sort of in lived experiences. I'm wondering about the healing and support part of this question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Father Godfrey wants to weigh in. If you can speak to sort of spiritual and soul
I'm
healing.
not quite sure what the question means. Maybe you, I mean, I guess you have talked about a spiritual path that people are on, and you've been on your own path in terms of your own transformation.
The question,
Yeah.
I don't know how to raise my hand yet, but the question actually came about from a veteran administration at USF symposium, and part of the healing circle from the Indigenous opener, I don't even know, I can't even recall, it's been years now, was that part of the healing process for the vets with PTSD, integral to that was some faith-based spiritual work and also a service, being in service to others, help them. So I just wonder, as you speak to kind of healing and victims and coming together in the gray matter that isn't black and white, are there justice ministries that are on the team? Are there support groups for men who have found that to be, mostly men maybe, part of the work?
Well, I mean, yes, there are. I mean, in San Quentin before COVID, I was going into one such group in the LGBTQ plus community in San Quentin. I was getting to know people every on Saturday mornings, and that was having a big effect on my own journey. But there are groups like that for sure, especially in San Quentin, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I do think, I mean, just to sort of add on to that, I think for a lot of people, there really is like a spiritual or a religious component to restorative justice. Not for everybody, but for some people there really is. And I think they do feel that there's sort of a connection that they make to a higher power. And I guess this isn't exactly related, but one of the things I did when I was researching my book is I spent 3 days at this restorative justice retreat in North Carolina. And it was in this really beautiful space. It was pretty simple, but it had a lot of property, I think a couple of acres. And the folks who were there were about 17 of them, victims and people who had, well, actually it was exonerees and the original crime victims coming together. It was pretty extraordinary. And there was a lot of, really hard circle work being done during the day. And then there were just these really like sort of joyous things that would happen at night that I thought were also healing, silly games, rhyming games, games that almost like children would play, flying kites, having s'mores. There was just ways of people connecting in this very like joyful coming together, which isn't service work, but it was like a building up of community that I thought was very beautiful and connecting. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that people got as much out of that part as they did in the other part, but they got a lot out of it. And there was also just an art therapy component where there were construction projects and folks really just were able to engage in kind of a more playful and creative side of themselves. And that was built into the weekend. And I thought it was very healing and powerful to watch. This is from Rabbi Angel. She wrote, my friends who are lifelong public defenders would benefit so much from hearing you and reading you. Hearing you share your experiences and wisdom gives me hope, and I know it with them. Where can people follow you and read you and support your work outside of the university? That is a very nice question. So let's see. Well, they can always email me My email is on the university website. They could probably direct message me on Twitter at Lara Bazelon. I actually have a website, although I haven't updated it in a while, but you can read about some of the stuff that I've done there. And then my book is called Rectify: The Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction. I think you can still get it on Amazon. But yes, I'm happy to talk to anybody, and particularly public defenders, having been one myself. It's a really amazing job. It's also a hard job with a high level of burnout. And I think it can really just be helpful to connect with other people who've been in that life. You know, it's a very specific kind of life. And even though I don't do it anymore, I feel incredibly connected to it, to the point where I still call the office where I worked my office, even though I haven't worked there since 2008.
Thank you so much. It's really been powerful to hear you. I texted 3 of my friends who are public defenders, and we're like, I'm give me your address. This is your Hanukkah present.
I love public defenders. They're my people.
You can tell. I think if there's a conference of public defenders, you should be the spiritual highlight messenger.
Thank you.
Laura, Professor Bazelon, I want to thank you for a really provocative presentation. And what was provocative for me personally was the ways in which you began the you began the process, which is very much a cognitive exercise, and then you flipped a switch somewhere in there, and you turned the mirror back on the individual through that line of questioning, and you used yourself as an example of how you can take the principles of restorative justice and begin to look at one's own life and be able to apply it as such, which I think is something that I think I agree with Rabbi Camille, that there is a power, even as you're discussing it, it feels like a cognitive exercise, and all of a sudden it becomes an interior spiritual exercise, and the hearer or the participant or the attendee is not expecting it. And so I wanted to thank you for the ways in which you included that slide, because I think it's quite powerful. And then being able to situate your own story in it. Because that is a tool that can be used for further purposes, to help people understand how restorative justice is not about other people, or even the case in which you were talking about it in the criminal justice system, but it is a mechanism for us to be able to evaluate our own lives and our own relationships. So I just want to thank you for that, because it was unexpected.
Mary, that means the world coming from you. And I just want to say, this is very much a work in progress, and I try as hard as I can to live up to it. And unfortunately, all too often it's aspirational. But even just like writing the slide made me realize like the specific work that I have to do now, and sort of like gave me a real motivation to do it. And so I'm glad it did not come off as preachy, because I was almost like reminding myself that that's an ongoing struggle. And so I'm glad that spoke to you. And I want to make it really clear that it's extremely aspirational, as I try as best as I can to be a less angry, more forgiving, and more understanding person, and really commit to hearing other people in a very profound sense of hearing, and not just, you know, doing the bare minimum and sticking to my narrative and marching on.
Perhaps if anybody else would like to ask a question or make a comment. If not, we're coming up towards the end of our time. You mentioned you might have overshared. Not at all. I think the purpose of the series is precisely what you've done, Professor Bazelon, in terms of bringing together a personal and the academic and intellectual. And Pope Francis says that once our health crisis is over, perhaps we'll begin no longer to think of them and us, but only of us Thank you for reminding me of that. And I'm with Rabbi Camille. You've given me a lot to think about, but also a reason to hope in a painful, difficult time in our country and in our world. So really, on behalf of everybody, I want to thank you so much for this, for sharing today. And I look forward to seeing you and everybody else in person sometime, hopefully in the new year. So thank you again very much, Lara. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Godfrey, for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to everyone who came. It was really nice to see you on Zoom. And I hope that next year we will be in person having a delicious meal.
Me too. Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care.